Welcome to ClickPoint, where we explore how this powerful combination transforms lives across industries like education, technology, venture capital, and sustainability. Today, we are speaking to Jessica Millstone, who is the co-founder and managing director of Copperwire Ventures. Copperwire Ventures is an early-stage fund focused on investing in women-led technology companies, primarily in the education space. And a really interesting topic that we get into today is the messy middle space between fully digital and fully in-person communication. Let's get into it. All right. I am so excited to have you on the pod. I don't love that term, but I love you as a person and what you do. So I'm gonna drop right in. And I'm going to ask you an initial question.
Mm-hmm.
And if it looks up occasionally and it looks like I'm praying, it's just, that's where my notes are. I should have said that earlier.
Okay.
All right, here we go. Initial question. What inspired you to start using technology, which sounds crazy, like that phrase, within the work that you do?
It's actually such a good question. I think about this all the time. Like, I'll just sidebar quickly to say that I taught early career teachers for a long time. I was a professor of education at Bank Street, and I always gave them this assignment. Tell me about what drew you to technology, whether it's a personal connection, a professional one. Was it in your family history? What's the first technology you
Right.
used? I actually think it's so important for us to think about our historical connection to it because it's often been additive, and now maybe we went through it, there was like a tipping point and it became like we're trying to like extract it from our
Huh.
lives. um and so like for me, I'm still of the generation, as we
Yeah.
both are, of growing up. Not it was very additive. Like, you didn't have to use a lot of technology to live your
Right.
life. When I was growing up in the mean streets of Bethesda, Maryland,
It's hard
suburban
there. Even the additive piece.
suburban Washington
The additive
D.C.
piece, like, how there
Yeah,
was like a kid on your block who had a computer, and you'd go
right,
over there and you'd be like,
exactly.
whoa. And then it's like, all right, my parents aren't
So
here.
I was
You
that
were that
kid.
kid. Okay. Yeah. Talk about that.
Yes, I was that kid. My my family has a large family business, and my grandfather died very unexpectedly. After my dad was like 30, he worked for his dad his whole life and had no idea what he did. Like, it was
Mm.
all in my grandfather's head. And so my dad actually spent a very big part of the late 70s, 80s, early 90s, like digitizing his business so that that would not happen to the next generation after him. So I grew up in this very industrial manufacturing kind of business. My family's in the scrap metal business, but we had computers, we had software developers, we had this very early point of sale inventory program called Scrapware that was, my dad basically co-designed with the software
Hmm.
developer who created it. It was very much a big part of our life that we had tech all the time. And we did have a computer at home, and we had a modem where you like place the receiver on
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
the
Yeah.
cradle, and it makes the like incredibly
Yeah.
annoying, sound. And I was on in early virtual communities, with, screen names and handles and lots of inappropriate emoticons, I'm sure. And, so it was a big part of my life growing up. And so it was additive, but consistently additive. So I was always in the mode of adding the next new technology. As I got older, into high school, I had a laptop in college in the late 80s, early 90s.
That was fancy.
It was, so I wasn't like in the computer lab. I wasn't in the computer lab with a floppy disk trying to print
Hold on.
my
Let me
essays.
pause
Like, I
this.
was,
Let me pause this for the
Mhm.
millennials and the Gen Zers, if I'm so lucky, that will listen to this episode. At one point, when you and I were in college, you would go to a room to use the computer
Mhm.
to check an
Yes.
email.
And there were probably Yeah. Well, there were probably some typewriters in there. And actually, I did not even have email until my senior year of
Right,
college. Like that was, and I only got email because you needed it to register for one of the classes that I was taking. So there was like a professor who decided to make it his life's mission that everybody, get on this email
right,
train and, use email. Some people use it before me, people, especially people who were studying abroad, like they had earlier
right.
access to that.
But the fact you had your
And
own
yeah, anyway,
laptop
so
during this time, so you could
hmm
sit in your dorm
hmm
room and use a laptop,
hmm
that is, people like today, it seems incredulous that that wouldn't exist. You know what I mean? So I'm trying to
yeah.
create context for how like tech forward you were at that point.
Yeah, yeah, that you would have, yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't in our pocket. The computers weren't in our pockets the way they are now, like
Right.
supercomputers, just in our back pocket, literally. But I definitely had a laptop, and had a lot of personalized. I was personalizing that technology all the time. Like, how is this like fitting into my life? How is it enhancing it? Making those decisions and calls all the time. It never felt like forced on me. It was very much like these are progressions that I'm making
Mm.
towards a more technology rich existence. Always. It always felt that way, just because of like I think how early it started for me. It was sort of I'm not a Gen Z, obviously I'm a Gen Xer, but I kind of feel digital native because I had it from maybe the earliest times that I remember.
And you know, not to date both of us, but I'm a little bit, I'm like probably like a year or two behind you. And similar to you, like my mom was she basically had a role where she was a computer programmer, and so she was working on the, like we'd go
Hmm.
to work with her, and there would be the room that was the mainframe, that's what she called it, but that was the
Right.
actual computer that is way less powerful than our phones right now. And so we were
I know.
also the family that had the computer first, where people would come
Hmm.
and we're learning basic, you know, literally basic as a programming language. Um,
Yep.
and
Yep.
so I think that's so interesting, that parallel, and even the fact that you are like the way you've just identified yourself as a digital native within Gen X, because for most of us within Gen X, technology, it was an ongoing discovery, and it tends to still be. So along
Hmm.
those lines, you're coming from this place where you are a digital native, you're using technology in ways that we use every day now, but would probably seem futuristic if you had friends come over
Hmm.
or you were describing what your dad was doing. Um,
Hmm.
Along those lines, how do you use technology now to leverage the impact of your work? And to qualify this, you are like a threefer, you know, in the way that this, you know, the focus of this podcast is around people who work within technology, people who work within impact, and people who work within education. And you are you are hitting three of these within your role with Copperwire. So, you know, and we're going to dig even deeper, but initially, how do you leverage technology now, coming from this person who's always been forward looking with technology, and
Hmm.
how you've seen, you know, how you saw your dad use it, how you used it in college? How do you use technology to really leverage the impact that you have within your role at Copperwire?
Yeah. I'm very selective about it. I have a lot of exposure to a lot of new
Of course.
technologies, but I'm very selective about the ones that I actually integrate into my work, specifically my work. I probably would am more flexible about integrating technologies into my life
Huh.
and than I am into my work.
Let's
And
break those down.
a little bit,
I want life and work.
yeah. I mean, I've been like very conscious observation of so my work in education specifically. I notice that there's a lot of resistance to bringing technology into
Mm-hmm.
education. It's been like that
Mm-hmm.
since I started. I've always worked around the space of integrating technology, so I've always been, butting up against that resistance. But there came a time, probably 10 or 15 years ago, where you could see that the personal use of technology was very much influencing the professional use of it in
Ah.
the classroom specifically. And, part of that was like a younger cohort of teachers. They just had more fluency or more exposure to the technology. But I also saw like with veteran teachers, like just this kind of transition or translation of a personal use into their professional
Mm,
lives. And I actually really admired that. Like there, it was very intentional and conscious, and I've replicated that as much as possible in my own adoption of technologies in my professional life. So I'm pretty careful about adding something. Also, because of what I was just saying at the top of the podcast, which is that, we're in this phase of extracting technology from our
right,
lives, like very
right.
consciously trying to remove the use of technology. So I'm a little more on the selective side from the outset, as opposed to trying to extract it later or having a bad experience with it and then extracting it
Would you
later.
say would you
But
say that
mhm,
you almost product test it personally before you bring it into your professional? And
it's a good way to put
and
it.
if
Yeah,
that's the
good way to put
case,
it.
can you give an example of a way that you
Mhm.
did this where you saw like, all right, this works for me here? Because what you're talking about with teachers, I totally relate. And similar to you, I've done so much work with tech
Mhm.
integration within different types of schools. And that just became like a subconscious or even a conscious sort of approach at a
Mhm.
point where it's just like, well, you use this in this way. This is very similar, like how to make that connection. So I'd love to hear about how, like an example of how you sort of progress something from your personal life into your professional tech stack.
Yeah. So two things. So two things come to mind immediately. The first one is older screenshots. So like I screen grab so much. I think we all do.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very familiar habit we have of just like taking a screenshot of something as a way to jog our
Yeah.
memory. And then I started to like bring those screenshots into either notes that I share, like, collaborative Google Docs, or presentations, or ways in which I'm illustrating some kind of thing for a person that I'm working with, and really bringing the screenshots into there, taking screenshots, like filing them away, categorizing them in a way on my phone so that I can access them
Yeah.
later, for my professional use. So I feel like that's one that I was always using personally, just to remember something, or maybe send to somebody, as a something on the street that I thought was funny, share it with them, connect with them that way. Now I really bring it into like my professional life. And in fact, I just got pitched, because I was telling somebody about this. They connected me with a founder who is creating an app for that, a sort of screenshot based app. And
Huh.
so I got to hear her pitch. I got to hear her pitch, and like sort of how she also, from her personal use of that technology, is creating a very professional, or productivity sort of app that takes advantage of that habit that we have of doing screenshots.
Mm.
Anyway,
All right.
to be continued also as that app, maybe comes out onto the
Yeah.
market. So that's one example. But then I would also say, like, more recently, I would put the AI, like chatbots, generate any kind of generative AI. I would put it into this category too, where I am still experimenting with that on a personal
Mm.
level before I think about how I would bring that in professionally, either to my work as an investor, or even community building in the education space, the ed tech
Hmm.
ecosystem. I think I will like still experiment with that more personally before I bring that in professionally.
So the other day, I was working on a presentation as part of this project, and I was working with two other people, and they had way more experience working within this space. It was specifically in the impact and less in the education space. And similar to you, I've experimented with things personally. Like I went to Italy this summer, and I used generative AI to book a lot of things where I could only like the people I was dealing with would only spoke Italian, and so I use that as my translator, and that was like my personal example of it. And then this project that I was working on, I specifically, and I'll, whatever, we're not sponsored by them, but Claude specifically was an amazing thought partner around creating basically experiential, or sort of like a group sort of design process, and it gave me so many great ideas in a short period of time. And I love that you're flagging that as an example, and I think everyone's sort of going through this, and we're definitely going to talk more about AI. But that way of doing it, I think, is really great because there's a lot of people, whether they're educators or they're in social impact or even in like I'm going to say air quotes regular business, that have so much fear around AI, and they think that like I need to get this thing in right now, but they don't think
Hmm.
how can I run these little experiments personally to get comfortable with it, to begin to see things through that lens. And so,
Yeah, I mean, my professional life has really taught me the value of the experiment.
mhm,
Like that's a language that we use a lot in building product. Especially around the user experience
yeah,
part. Like you try some stuff and then get feedback, and then you incorporate that in. So in a way, like that's the professional world having impact on my personal life.
mhm,
But then taking the lesson of that and applying it back into professional. I'm glad you mentioned Claude. Actually, Claude is the AI wrapper, I guess you call it, that I'm
mhm,
using for a lot of this personal stuff. I think it's a very interesting thought partner, and I'm very um, excited about that way in which we're thinking about AI as like a brainstorming partner, not like not like asking a question and getting an
mhm,
answer, but much more of a collaborative brainstorming
yeah,
partner. And I have like my husband's cousin uses Claude a lot. He introduced me to it, and he actually like talks to Claude all the time, like, how are you? What's going on today? Like, very kind of like warm it up, like, sort of, like
interesting,
think of it very conversationally as a way to remind himself to be using this as like a sounding board. This is not just like these are open-ended
right?
questions. They're not, like binary. There's some knowledge out there in the internet, and it's bringing it back for you.
Huh.
So
Okay, you're sparking so many ideas now. By the way, we talk not as much as we should, but every time we talk, it feels like this. I'm like, oh, you've said this, and like these things are lighting off in my brain. Um,
Well, likewise. I mean, no, you just said like one thing, and I was like, oh my God, we're getting like so deep into my family
right.
history, and then also the future at the
At
same
the
time.
same time, yeah, it's almost retro futurism. Anyway, see
Right.
how we did that? Um, so I want to talk more about Claude. I'm gonna take a step back really quickly. Have you started reading the new relatively to when this is heard, the Yuval Harari book Nexus?
No, not yet, but I know of it.
Can't recommend it enough. There's a section in the
Hmm.
book where he sort of breaks down interactions in these three ways: that we come from a society that has been predicated upon human to human interaction. Even the way we were talking about computers being additive, but we lived within a world where it's like all the information, whether you're doing something professionally, personally, all of it happened in a human way, human to human way. And over time, through apps, computers, and definitely now generative AI, we've introduced this computer to human interaction or network, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
similar to what you're talking about with your husband's cousin. And then he talks about a third piece, which is a computer to computer network, which has existed, but not in a generative way that it can sort of exist now as far as AIs talking to each other. So, um, within that framework or that context, how how are you using technology, or which specific tools um, have you sort of adopted that you find are the most effective to connecting with people? And I'm going to give you this little story as an example. I once Someone did something really nice for me. I'm going to keep it really vague because I don't want them to know that they're this person. They did this thing that was really nice for me, and so I decided,
You don't want them to know how much you appreciate the
no,
thing
well, you
that
got to
you're
hear
about
the
to
whole
say.
story. You have to hear the whole story.
Okay,
And
okay, okay,
so
got
I
it.
decided to send them a handwritten letter. First of all, I rarely write these days, and my handwriting when I wrote regularly was atrocious. Um, I get really self conscious about
Mm.
writing. And so at the time, I was like, all right, I'm going to plug a bunch of stuff into Chat GPT, and it's going to give me a framework. Like, I know what I want to say, but I don't know quite how to say it in a way that I feel would really resonate with them. And so I did that, and I went back and forth, and I edited it, and then I wrote out this handwritten letter, and I sent it to them. And then I didn't hear from them for a while, and then I'd forgotten about it. And then they wrote me back like, this was an amazing letter. I'm going to keep this forever. I love the fact that you wrote it and what it said. And so that's the part where it's like I feel a little disingenuous because I didn't write it by
Mm,
myself. Like I had the framework for it, but I
mhm,
had a ton of help.
mm.
Um,
Yeah. Well, you're definitely applying a value judgment to what the output of that is from a previous generation. Like
exactly.
you're like, like thinking about it, like what you would have gone through 10 years ago to handwrite something is very different than this. So you're applying a value judgment that old way is better.
But I'm also applying it because I think that I know that this person would value that old
Hmm.
way over
Right.
this new
You're
way.
applying their value. Yeah.
Exactly, to that and the way they're
Hmm.
perceiving it. So from your perspective, that's a,
I mean, you don't know. I mean, it could have been that just um the effort of writing something out and putting it into the mail is what
no,
they
I'm and
value.
this is why I'm keeping it vague because the way they responded, it was about the content of the letter. And
I
I was
see.
like,
Okay.
I'm just gonna let this one go. I'm just gonna accept the joy that came with it, but I don't want them to know, oh well, I wrote this with AI. But it was a really good
Yeah.
example of me leveraging technology
Yes.
to connect with someone.
Hmm.
How,
Hmm.
within your work, do you leverage technology to do the same thing?
Yeah, so I would say that I do it in very simplistic ways comparatively. Like one thing that was very important to me during my journey of becoming an investor was to have a open form on my website where people could just email me that they're, raising capital for whatever startup it might be. I mean, I gave some parameters of what I usually invest in, but there was no certainly the responses that I got were not necessarily, tailored to exactly my space that I work in. But it was like it was a way to connect with people directly to say, to make it, first of all, to like make it a little less, you know, that you have to go through like a warm introduction to get introduced to me I wanted to, it to be that I was a lot more accessible than that typical investor. I wanted it to be something that I was getting directly into my inbox, like not, filtered by any other kind of, person or any kind of filter that was going to keep me from hearing about all of the opportunities that were out there. Anyway, I really wanted to be accessible in that way. So, have that open-ended form. So that's one way. And then I would say the second right following that is I really try to move off email into Zoom or personal meetings with people pretty quickly. So I think that that's kind of a trend. It's not me only doing this, but having very short email exchanges or any kind of messaging exchange and like jumping into some kind of a chat that you're at least seeing and hearing that person, whether or not you're in the same room with them physically or not, much more of a personal connection right away to get the real story behind something and then see where it goes from there.
Now that you and I know we talked about this a little bit in the beginning. You raise a really great point because when you're talking about the value assigned to using technology as opposed to meeting with people face to face, and we had a lot of
Hmm.
that sort of begin to blur during COVID, where we
Hmm.
couldn't do that, and so we had to find ways to connect with people digitally, and so it became more of a spectrum and less. I sent them an email, or I flew out there to go meet them. How do you sort of reconcile the relationship between using tech and maintaining human connection? And it once again, this is on a spectrum because as we've discussed, you
Hmm.
and I maintain a connection, but I've definitely communicated with you more digitally than I have
Right.
in person.
Yeah, I think we've kind of crossed a tipping point where the digital connection, the more frequent or more casual maybe digital connection that we can have, the the more you know someone. I mean, in a way, I mean, I have days that I dedicate to in-person meetings so that I can, physically get from one place to
Right,
another in New York City to do that. And those days are maybe more draining in some ways than my Zoom
right.
days or days where I might be doing less of that. Um, I do really enjoy that personal connection. Like I just had lunch with somebody who was visiting from the Bay Area. We had tried to connect over the summer in another country that we were both in. We were definitely prioritizing the in-person connection. We were just trying to like match up our travel schedules to be able to meet in person after having one or two Zoom calls. And then we had lunch, and it was really nice to meet her in person, and it was great. I don't think we got as much done during that
Huh.
time period as when we were on our Zoom calls. I think our relationship progressed more quickly over Zoom than it did just having lunch. I mean, there's a lot of like external factors to that. Like it was a really noisy restaurant, and it was maybe inconvenient, and she had a plane to catch, and so it was cut short a little bit. I actually think like in terms of value judgments, I'm leaning towards like the digital and the Zoom as being, whether it's text or Zoom or quick FaceTimes, audio, just, going back to phone
Hmm.
calls. Like I think that those are the ways where you actually have the more consistent and I think somewhat deeper possibilities. Yeah, it's like he's like, I don't know. It just it has occurred to me lately, like those like intermediate touch points have become more of the context of a relationship than the in-person time spent together.
Yeah, especially with the amount of things that we all have to do, with families,
Yeah,
work, all of that. And you raised a really good, really interesting point. The idea of connection not necessarily being predicated on the format, but more the context. So you were connecting with someone in person, but they had a plane to catch. And so they weren't as present as they would be if they were
right.
at home and it's like, all right, this is my 45
Hmm.
minutes with Jessica and I'm ready for this and I've planned, I know like a week in advance this is going to happen so I can set this up. Um, and
Hmm.
it's an interesting frame because I hadn't thought of that. Because not the few times, it's been more than a few times, but usually when I meet up with you in person, it's like a
Hmm.
thing that has been planned. I'm looking forward to it, and what I haven't factored in are like the different sort of factors around that make it meaningful.
Right.
You know,
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's something. It's like maybe. I mean, and also it's a little bit of. I think it's very personal also in your life, like how much other human contact you already have because you have a family or you have a very rich like hobby
yeah,
life or a sports
yeah.
life or something, like maybe there's a lot of extracurriculars you're already doing, so you're already in touch with a lot of people all the time, so maybe you don't need that professionally as much as you would otherwise, or personally.
And a generational piece
But
too, because to the
hmm.
point you were talking about like
Hmm.
chat rooms and being early on that. Obviously people who are from generations younger than us grew up within a setting of connecting with people digitally. So my daughter
Hmm.
uses this one app, like she doesn't have a phone. And both my wife and I got tired of like setting up FaceTimes for her and her friends because none of us have house lines
Hmm.
anymore. Where she uses this one app
Exactly.
and I'll hear her and she's like, all right, let's plan our outfits for tomorrow, or let's do this, or let's plan a sleepover. And they're connecting in that way, in addition to what's happening during the school day. And, for context, she's
Right.
she's a second grader. So, she's in that 7-8 realm. Um, and, I think about myself at that age. I didn't have to, it's like I went to school and I came home and that was it.
Hmm.
And so I would connect with people in school, or I'd have play dates, or maybe we'd talk on the phone. But if you are at that
Hmm.
age learning how to connect with people further in that digital way, so that when you reach our points or whatever, even like 10 to 15 years younger than us,
Hmm.
it is completely natural to build professional and personal relationships, mostly in a digital medium. And so,
Right.
oh,
Right.
go ahead, go ahead.
I was also going to say there's a couple other, like, first of all, I just want to say it's incredibly ironic. I'm like sitting right here, and the book that was right underneath of my phone is this Sherry Turkle book called Alone
Yes,
Together, which is a little bit about how different generations of people growing up are like more apt to text rather than talk.
yes.
So they feel like they're together, but they're actually not. So I wanted just to say, like, first of all, it's ironic that it's sitting on top of this. I was having this conversation, and it felt like maybe I was going towards digital over personal, but I do really think it's that in between the
Hmm.
Zoom call, the phone call, the um voice memos, like a whole other, like I spent a lot of time in South America in the last couple of years, and like there's a whole culture of like
Yep.
leaving voice
Yep.
memos on your
Yep.
phone, so you're really hearing context and tone and communicating all the other things that are not just like the words that you
Right.
say or the order in which you
The
say them.
nuance.
So I think the nuance comes through, I think, on these voice memos. So I have like some, again, starting personally, now professionally, I'm starting to be on
Mm.
WhatsApp a lot more, where you can really so easily leave these voice memos. And that's more the culture of that
It is.
particular mode of communication on WhatsApp, is to leave voice memos. And I'm loving it. I think that that's like, it just really adds so much to the frequent, consistent, only contextualized interactions that you can have with your professional
So
colleagues.
yeah, our like my friend, our mutual friend Luca, who lives in Australia, who I interviewed, or he's on another episode. He talked about the idea of Australians being almost isolated because they're so far away from everyone, and so the idea of
Mm-hmm.
communicating digitally is just inherent to them, especially in this
Mm-hmm.
international way, because Australians love to travel. They do an amazing job of that. And to your point,
Mm-hmm.
he is the person that leaves me the most voice memos. And I love it. I never
Mm-hmm.
think to leave people voice memos. I will leave someone a voicemail before I leave them a voice memo. That is not a go-to for me. Um,
Right,
and
right.
he,
And somehow those things have become different, which I think
yes,
is kind of funny
yes,
too. They are like, voicemail is like so
right,
retro and like, what your parents
right.
do, and voice memo is actually quite
It's
cutting
cool.
edge and
Yeah.
more, cool. Yeah,
And everybody
exactly.
can join in.
Well, there is a little bit more of a synchronicity around it. I mean, I think that the voicemail is like, this is an
Mm-hmm.
archive, this is just me stating this thing, whereas a voice memo is, I think, has a little more of a
Yes.
conversational, like, this is a dialogue
Yes.
that we're having together.
So, all right. To your point, the idea of, and I'm not going to box you in, but the idea of having digital connections with people, and in some instances, it being a more effective way, not only to
Hmm.
conduct business, but to also get to know people because of
Yeah.
the convenience around when people have the space to do it.
Hmm.
Do you have an example of a digital connection? And I'm going to exclude myself from this because I know we talk more digitally, but
Hmm.
I met you initially in person.
Hmm.
Do you have an example of a digital connection that led to a significant in-person collaboration?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, probably the people I communicate with the most through these voice memos and WhatsApp is the founders of the Transcend Network,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Alberto, and Michael. And they, one is based in Madrid, one's based in Miami. So they're away from
Right.
me, and time zone
Right.
wise, Alberta is pretty far. So it's a little bit of tag teaming. Like, you like will leave a message
Right.
and then you'll get it
Right.
later. Coincidentally, I have another professional colleague. I did actually meet her in person first here in New York, but we've had an almost exclusively digital relationship since then. She's also based in Madrid. And both of those have turned into very much directionally the way in which my investing life has gone.
Huh.
And so a huge impact. I can't say that the way in which we communicate is the reason why, but if you have, to your point about your friend and colleague Luca, like, if there's a person who you really want to work with in
Right.
some way and they don't live anywhere
Right.
near you, these technologies have stepped in to bridge distance,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can live where you want to live or where you're from, and you can have the life that you want to have, and it doesn't really hamper your professional aspirations or trajectory. In fact, I think it does, like, to your point, enhance it. It really actually creates these opportunities for professional enhancement that weren't there before.
Huh. All right.
When we first started talking, I wrote down something about the Zoom and phone call being what, like, the messy
Yeah.
middle, um, in between a fully digital communication and a fully in-person communication. but messy makes it sound like, again, value judgments, but makes it sound worse than either one of those two things. But I actually feel like that's like this where all this stuff is happening. Like it's like all the nitty gritty, the work that you
Yeah.
do, the real kind of advancement or progress that you might make on something is happening in these like in between spaces. And the digital might just be the introduction, and the personal might just be the icing. Like that's like the reward you get for having, kept up with all the digital communication in the middle.
Or even the
But that's how
validation,
I kind of visualize
the
it.
validation
Yeah,
of that
yeah.
relationship where you have those check-ins. Like I know, if I know that I come to New York at least 2 to 3 times a year, and when I'm in New York, and if you're in town, that's a validation point.
Hmm.
But it's never like, oh
Yeah.
well, we need to meet so we can close the deal, you know. It is it.
Well, exactly. And I feel like that's what it used to be, and
Yes.
it's not
Yeah.
anymore. Like it's really much more of a pleasurable, like uh you know add on, not add on, I don't want to
But
say
it
add
kind
on
of
in terms of
is
like
not expended,
expendable, but
but
it's like
additive. It's
people
additive
crave
to the
it, people
relationship.
crave it.
and
It's
and there was
additive,
that
exactly,
flip
it's additive.
flop, like, you know, we were talking about, like, in college, kids who traveled internationally, and then an email
Hmm.
was additive, because even within this entire discussion, there was this project that I did with kids for the past 2 years at this Jewish day school that I worked at, where there was someone who was connected to the school who owned all of this memorabilia from the Holocaust. And the kids did this thing where they basically took these letters, that were these handwritten letters that were sent from people who were serving in World War II, and took them and then basically added their audio to them and created like an experience in the museum where you could hear someone reading the letters, as opposed
Hmm.
to trying to transcribe the script that they were written in, that sort of thing, and created more access to the stories that were attached to that. And it made me think that was how these things happened. That was the, to, you know, borrow your phrase, the messy middle, was the letters going back
Hmm.
and forth of building those relationships, which is now sort of transitioned into this immediacy of the voice memos, of the Zooms, of whatever, you know, even a TikTok, whatever it might be. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's really interesting to see that progression. And even the fact that we're both saying, yeah, no one has to, I mean, I won't say no one. I have a friend who lives in New York, and he's like, yes. And I go down there and I fly and I get and we sign the deal. And, you know, that is like tied to the world that he lives in, which is more around real estate. Um, but
Hmm.
within,
Hmm.
I mean, you are, you know, not to, I'm not in any way sort of like being reductive. You are in the world of finance. It is from an education lens, but that is the business world. And
Hmm.
you're talking about
Hmm.
maintaining and building partnerships with people in 3 different locations. And most of it is done digitally, and some of it is done asynchronously,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is a really interesting
I think,
shift.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's the world we live in. And maybe that's even a divergence from how it's evolved in my personal life. Like sort of getting back to this idea that there's ways in which I try to experiment personally before I apply professionally. Maybe I would say what you just described is something that's divergent than what happens in my personal life. It's not really, I mean, I'm linked together with lots of people in my
Mm-hmm.
family or extended family, and friends, of course, remotely. But I think that I find that these technologies have left my personal life a little bit, and like they're much more in my professional world now.
Huh. So, and not to go too far into this, but with your, on your personal side, like with relatives who live far further away, there has to be a level of what you're taking from your personal side and bringing it into that, whether it be sharing holiday photos, you know, and are you doing it on social
Hmm.
media? Or like for me, I don't put images of my kids online, but I have like an Apple photo stream that I share with people. And that is a way of, that is almost like the voice memo of sharing those moments
Hmm.
with people. And so within your
Hmm.
personal life, do you find that you are making it, because in the beginning we were talking about trying to, we're all in this place where we're trying to extract the technology and increase the amount of actual in-person connection that we get to experience and that we take part in. And I think that's also reactive in a good way to what happened through COVID. So in your personal life, do you find that you are extracting more technology and trying to connect more with people in person? Or is there still a bit of a mirror of that messy middle in order to maintain the scale of connections that we all have as a result of technology, including within our own families?
Yeah, I mean, I've really downsized the number of platforms that I use. I'm not on Facebook
Mm-hmm.
anymore, but I am on
Mm-hmm.
Instagram, which I know is owned by Facebook, as is WhatsApp.
Actually, technically Meta,
Um,
but whatever.
Meta, excuse, yes, exactly, excuse me. So I know that, I'm still like beholden to the targeted
Right,
advertising piece of that
right.
company. But I don't really participate in sort of the longer form messages or even groups that Facebook has.
Mm.
But what I do on Instagram, what I've noticed has become my more Instagram specific modality is to be very if I'm somewhere else in the world, I'll post more about what's happening in my life, like I'm visiting this place or I'm eating at this restaurant or whatever, because oftentimes, and this has happened so many times now, I kind of use it in this way. I let somebody know that I'm in Bogota,
Yeah,
Colombia, and they message me and they send me great restaurants
right,
to eat at,
right.
or they know they have a friend who's there, and I met some people in like the Colombian startup community, entrepreneurs, because somebody I know had lived in Bogota and had some connections there.
Huh.
So it's just, there's just like a way in which, letting like sort of broadcasting something about yourself can then lead to those in-person connections that I find very valuable. So I use, and that's just personal, I use Instagram personally. Back in the day when I was on Twitter, I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I used it professionally, very
Yeah.
similar. So I would post things about conferences that I was
Yep.
at or events that were coming up, and that was a way to connect professionally, same thing, with people who were going to be in that same place, and might even be how we met back in the
No, no,
day.
no. Okay. No, we met in person, but at a conference. It was offline
Hmm.
because to be honest, as you were talking about this, I think the only medium that we're connected on is LinkedIn. Because I was like, I don't
Right.
think I'm connected to you on
And that,
Instagram, you
yes.
know.
And then I think that LinkedIn has replaced Twitter for exactly that
Yes.
professional outreach
Agreed.
purpose. It's a little bit more, I mean, I guess now I use it a little more as a retroactive, like
Right.
more announcement focus. Like I did do this past tense as opposed to, hey, I'm heading to blah blah blah. Anybody, else going to be there? So I don't know. Again, it's very find these conversations really interesting because they allow me to reflect a little bit on my behavior and the way I try to be as intentional as possible about it. But maybe this is reminding me of a reason to use these platforms is to make that in person, uh, to find people in
Mm.
person as opposed to just promoting, work that they have this sort of self promotional piece of like things that you did in the past.
All right.
So
So
it's reminding me to do things ahead of time as opposed to
retroactively,
retroactively.
which I am 1,000% guilty of. 1,000. I am the worst at that. The problem with this medium that we're in right now, and the joy and the bonus of it is that the time always flies. So literally, we're at our
Mm,
last question. Like I had a whole thing,
okay.
but to be continued for this time. To be continued. So for this round, we're at our last question. Um,
Mhm.
You've talked about how you scale your connections with people digitally. And it's not even that you're scaling it from digital to, all right, I'm seeing you once a month. But you could scale it, from a digital connection from someone being on your website to maybe we're doing a Zoom once a month, or maybe we're talking on the phone, or we're doing a WhatsApp once a month.
Mhm.
So the question I have for you, is it possible, do you think, to scale in the opposite way? In other words, scale the number of meaningful connections that you have, not just the depth of connections through technology specifically in the work that you do?
I do. I mean, I think that going back to my use of LinkedIn, I think that is a place in which I've seen that be both um, easy to do and meaningful
Okay.
in the sense that you can broadcast something, and then the format of that platform is that you might post something, it has some
Mm-hmm.
pictures, maybe it has a link in it, and then there's the comments that come underneath. And the comments, I think, really do scale both what you have, be able to connect with people
Mm-hmm.
individually based on what you've
Mm-hmm.
posted. So you could have a one-on-one in a public kind of
Right.
setting, but like a one-on-one with somebody afterwards. And then also the way that platform works, which just was basically told to me not that long ago, is that because of just everybody in my network, other people see when maybe I've posted on somebody else's
Yes. Yeah. Or even if
post,
you
and
like
and
something,
so I
other people see
you
it.
like
Yeah.
something, and it exactly, so it comes up in another person's feed, and so you're both reconnecting with that person, who is seeing your name come up in their feed, and you're telling them a little bit about what you're thinking about these days, because it's like, oh, I just like
Mm.
read this post and I liked it, or I commented on it,
Yeah.
or you're sharing a little bit of like what's at least running through your mind, however fleeting it might be. I think that that's actually very powerful. Like it actually, and then it comes back around to you where somebody's like, oh, thanks for putting this on my radar. I appreciate that, and it made a big impact on me. And then you have that renewed connection with that person, that you haven't maybe talked to directly at all, but it comes back around.
And I'm going to add on to
Really
I'm going to add
direct.
on to the question that I just asked you. I think there's a piece there too when you go to these gatherings, you go to these conferences, and then you're also either connecting with people through there, or what I've started doing is tagging people in things. And so not only are you sharing what is important to you or what you're learning, but you're also contextualizing it with other people there who are doing other things. And to your point, because as you said it, I literally had a call with someone yesterday, and I was like, wait, how do I know you? And then he reminded me he commented on something, like an online
Yep.
conversation that I was having with someone
Hmm.
else on LinkedIn. Um,
Yep. Yeah. It's like it becomes the new kind of friend of a friend
yes.
referral in a way. And I've experienced this with you personally, where we have walked through a vendor, the expo hall at a conference
Yeah.
together, and you've in person introduced me to people that
Yeah.
that you recognize by face, or pretty well. And then I have ongoing relationships with those people, ongoing conversations with those people
I know
afterwards.
exactly who you're
So
talking
you're
about.
like,
I owe him a call too. I know. Yes. But
me
yes.
too.
Yes. Ironically, full
And
circle.
you can, I know. So we'll both call him on the same day
Yeah.
and be like, "Oh, we were just
Just
thinking
thinking
about you."
about you. Yeah.
Um, yes, very valuable, but really, I mean, that's the old school way to do it. So, like, yeah, like we're still from a previous generation. We can still walk through an expo hall and have an in person connection like
Yeah.
that. But it lives on beyond that one time now in what I would say is a very positive way.
Yeah.
I think that that's a positive thing that technology has given to us, that we can continue those very fleeting introductions into a much longer term
And
evolving
seed them and let them
conversation.
grow.
Hmm.
Man,
Hmm.
all right. I This is definitely gonna have to be part one because there's more here, but I'm trying to be conscious of people's attention spans and not just prattling on. And I know you probably have a full day. So I am just gonna close this out by saying thank you for your insight, for your wisdom, for your experience, but most importantly, your time to connect within the messy middle here.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that we have these technologies that let us do
Yeah.
that, and these are the ones that I want to be additive, not extract in my
Yes.
life.
Yes. All right. All right. Well, thank you everybody for listening. I think I'm supposed to say something, smash that like button or something like that, but whatever, that will come at some other point. But what I will say is, especially within the edtech space, if you are a founder or if you just have a really great idea and you're looking to connect with someone who can help you scale that, Jessica Millstone at Copperwire Ventures is someone that you should look up. And all that's, we'll put all this info where people will see where to find you and leave you one of those messages.
Sounds good.
So,
thank you.
All right, guys, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.